Keanu Reeves was boarding his jet for a routine charity trip, until a detective called with chilling news. His longtime pilot had just been arrested. But it wasn't for smuggling or fraud. What they found in a dusty storage unit would uncover a secret so profound it shattered everything Keanu thought he knew about the man. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The morning began like so many others for Keanu Reeves. Soft light spilled through the windows of his quiet Los Angeles home. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, and a light breeze stirred the curtains. He sat at his kitchen table, dressed in a gray hoodie and worn jeans, flipping through pages of handwritten notes. His pen tapped rhythmically against the paper, his focus steady. He had a flight scheduled for later that morning, a short trip to Vancouver to attend a board meeting for a children's health foundation he'd quietly supported for years. It wasn't a press event or a photo opportunity. It was personal. He had funded a wing in a pediatric hospital under complete anonymity and only attended meetings to stay informed, to listen, to serve. His notes were filled with ideas for a new initiative, something related to mental health access for underserved teens. Nothing was finalized yet, but his thoughts were sharp this morning, and the flight ahead would give him a few precious hours of uninterrupted focus. He looked forward to those moments in the sky. That's when his assistant, David, stepped into the room with an expression that broke the silence before he spoke a word. "Title just called from Monarch Aviation," David said. "Captain Grant won't be flying today." Keanu looked up slowly. "Elias?" David nodded. "They didn't give a reason. They said a replacement pilot is already being prepped." For a moment, Keanu didn't respond. He stared past David at the wall behind him, eyes narrowing just slightly. Elias Grant had flown him for almost 5 years. Same voice on the comms, same calm demeanor, same dependable presence on the tarmac. A man of few words but unwavering precision. Elias didn't miss flights. "Did he call?" Keanu asked. "No, nothing." Keanu's pen stopped tapping. He closed his notebook, almost reluctantly, and leaned back in the chair. It wasn't alarm he felt, not yet. Just an unfamiliar disruption in the rhythm of someone he thought he understood. David lingered a moment longer, unsure whether to say more, then turned and stepped out. Keanu stood slowly, stretched, and reached for his phone to check for messages. Nothing from Elias, nothing from Monarch beyond a standard scheduling notice. No delays, no explanation, just absence. Then, as he was placing his phone back down, it buzzed in his hand. Unknown number. Los Angeles area code. He answered with a quiet hello. "Mr. Reeves?" A woman's voice. Calm, professional. "Yes. This is Detective Hannah Myers, Los Angeles Police Department. I apologize for reaching you directly. It's important." Keanu's chest tightened, just a bit. "Go on." "I need to inform you that Captain Elias Grant was taken into custody late last night. I believe he's your primary pilot through Monarch Aviation." The room went very still. "Yes," Keanu said, his voice measured. "What happened?" "I can't discuss details over the phone," she said, "but it's more complicated than it may appear. I'd like to meet with you privately." Keanu's voice lowered. "Is he all right?" "He's not injured," Detective Myers replied, "but this isn't something I can explain quickly. I'm available to meet today, if that's possible." Keanu was already walking toward his office. "Where?" "I can meet you wherever you're comfortable. It's not a public matter yet. I'll text you an address," he said. 1 hour. "Thank you." The call ended. Keanu stood in his office now, still holding the phone in his hand, though the call had ended minutes ago. The house around him was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like something was about to shift beneath your feet. Elias Grant, arrested. Not delayed, not sick, not called away. Arrested. Keanu sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up his private contact sheet. He typed in the name of his security liaison at Monarch Aviation, but hesitated before hitting call. Something told him he wouldn't get more information than what the detective had already shared. Instead, he opened the small drawer to his right and pulled out a worn, black, leather-bound notebook. The first page was filled with travel dates, initials, and tail numbers, flight logs, notes on weather, tiny scribbles. In his quiet way, Keanu had always kept records, not for business, for clarity, for peace of mind. He turned to the last entry. 3 days ago, round trip from Santa Monica to Seattle. Elias had flown it. Smooth ascent, early arrival, coffee waiting in the hangar. Nothing unusual, nothing off. And yet now everything felt off. His phone buzzed again. David's voice came through the intercom system. "Detective Myers is on her way. She'll be here in about 30 minutes. Keanu nodded to himself. "Thanks." "Also," David added, "the new pilot has been assigned. They'll be ready for takeoff by noon if you want to keep the Vancouver schedule." Keanu exhaled through his nose, slow and silent. "Tell them to hold. I'm not going anywhere until I know what this is about." David's pause on the other end was short but meaningful. "Understood." Keanu hung up the call and stood again. He wandered to the tall window that overlooked the hillside. The city below was stretching into morning. Planes buzzed faintly in the distance. Life continued. Business, schedules, plans. But something about the phrase "taken into custody" lingered in the back of his mind, like an echo bouncing through a cave. Arrested. Elias Grant, who had always been there, never late, never distracted, never involved in anything beyond the flight manifest and his safety checklist, was sitting somewhere in a holding cell. For what? The more he tried to picture it, the harder it was to believe. Elias didn't even speed on the freeway. Once, during a layover, he had waited 2 full hours inside a fixed-base terminal after Keanu's meeting ran long. Never complained, just nodded when it was time to board. The man flew like a monk, quiet, disciplined, focused. And now he was the subject of a police investigation. Keanu rubbed his forehead, then looked down at his notebook again. Something about this didn't feel like a mistake. It felt deliberate, as if Elias had known this moment would come and said nothing. Detective Hannah Myers arrived at exactly 9:30 a.m., just as Keanu had requested. She stepped out of a discreet, unmarked sedan wearing a navy blazer and carrying a thin leather folder under one arm. Her stride was confident but unhurried, and her expression was neutral, calm, as if bracing herself for the weight of what she was about to deliver. Keanu met her at the entrance and led her inside without a word. The house was minimalist, warm and quiet, filled with wood tones and soft light. They sat in a small sitting room off the main hallway where the windows overlooked a cluster of trees. No press, no distractions, just the two of them and a silence that lingered before either spoke. Detective Myers glanced at Keanu's face and saw something most people missed. Stillness that came from deep restraint, not passivity. He was listening before she'd even started speaking. "Captain Elias Grant was arrested just after 11 p.m. last night," she began. "It started as a traffic stop, but it turned into something unexpected." Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Was he armed?" "No, not violent, not dangerous in that way," she said quickly. "But what we found, it wasn't small." She opened the folder and slid a single photo across the table. It showed Elias in street clothes, standing beside the open back doors of a cargo van. The van was filled with boxes, medical supplies, blankets, canned food, storage records, warehouse keys, surveillance footage. Myers added, "It's a lot, and it's still unfolding." Keanu studied the photo for a long time. Elias wasn't looking at the camera. His face was turned towards someone outside the frame. Someone small, judging by the angle, Maybe a child. Maybe several. What's he being charged with? Keanu finally asked. We're still determining the scope. Potential misuse of aviation clearances, distribution violations, maybe even interstate trafficking of unregistered medical aid. It's complicated. He looked up at her. Is that what this is? Medical aid? She hesitated. We think so. But this wasn't sanctioned. None of it. Keanu looked down at the photo again. Something stirred in his chest. Something tight and unresolved. Amy? He asked quietly. Because you're the only person Elias asked us not to notify. We did anyway, she said. Because I think you deserve to know. Whatever this is, it's much bigger than one arrest. Keanu didn't respond. But something inside him already knew. Elias Grant hadn't vanished. He had chosen this. Long before the word arrested was ever connected to his name, Elias Grant was a man Keanu Reeves trusted without hesitation. He remembered the first time he'd flown with Elias. It was just after wrapping a film shoot in Utah. The crew had recommended Monarch Aviation for private return travel. When Keanu stepped onto the tarmac, Elias was already standing by the jet, clipboard in hand, uniform crisp, eyes calm. No overenthusiasm, no forced friendliness, just a respectful nod and a soft-spoken, "Welcome aboard, sir." Keanu had liked him immediately. Over time, Elias became more than a familiar face. He was a fixture in Keanu's life. Reliable, silent, steady. The kind of person who never inserted himself into conversations but always made sure the cabin was set just the way Keanu liked. Dim lights, a folded blanket, a bottle of still water on the armrest. Always before being asked. During long flights, Elias preferred classical music, Mahler mostly, occasionally Chopin. Nothing distracting. Keanu once asked him about it, and Elias simply said, "It helps me land smoother." That was who he was. He never asked for selfies, never brought up movies, never fished for compliments or favors. Elias treated Keanu the same way he treated the aircraft. Precisely, respectfully, without excess. There was one flight Keanu remembered vividly. Somewhere between Albuquerque and Los Angeles, turbulence had suddenly worsened. The jet dropped just enough to make the cabin lights flicker. But there was no panic. Within moments, Elias came over the intercom, voice calm as still water. "Minor electrical interference. I've reset the system. We're holding steady. We'll arrive 5 minutes early." After landing, Keanu stepped into the cockpit. "Are we good?" he asked. Elias looked up and gave a small smile. She just needed a little patience. Later, Keanu found out that a backup navigation relay had failed mid-air. Elias had fixed it manually, rerouting through a secondary board, something only seasoned pilots even attempted, and rarely during flight. But he never mentioned it again. He didn't talk about stress. He didn't talk about much at all. Years passed. Flights came and went. Elias never missed one, never canceled, never showed up even a minute late. So when Detective Myers used the word custody, something inside Keanu rejected it. Not Elias, not the man who once delayed a flight for 30 minutes because a groundskeeper was stuck in an ice storm and he didn't want to take off until he knew the guy had a ride home. It wasn't a criminal. That was someone who noticed people most others overlooked. Keanu had always been a good observer of people. It was part of what made him such a grounded actor and an even more grounded human being. But Elias Grant had remained something of a mystery, even to him. After about a year of working together, Keanu had quietly asked his assistant David to do a discreet background check, not because of suspicion, but because of curiosity. Who was the man behind the uniform? Was he okay? Did he have family? Was he carrying something invisible behind those quiet eyes? The report came back short and simple. No debt, no criminal history, no spouse, no children, lived in a modest home outside Van Nuys, paid his taxes on time, drove an old Toyota that hadn't changed in years, attended veterans meetings occasionally, volunteered at a community airfield on weekends. That last detail had caught Keanu's attention. He remembered asking David, "What does a private jet pilot do at a public airfield?" David had shrugged. "No clue. Just says he logs hours and helps with maintenance." Keanu had left it at that. Everyone has their way of staying grounded. And maybe that little airfield was Elias. Now, looking back, that detail felt different. Not suspicious, but layered. Like something was hiding in plain sight. Over the years, Keanu had tried, gently, to connect with him on a more personal level. A casual question after landing, a comment about the view during a flight over the Rockies. Elias always responded politely, but never lingered. One time, on a trip back from Calgary, Keanu had asked if he ever got tired of flying. Elias had paused, eyes focused on the horizon through the cockpit windshield. "I don't fly to escape the world," he said softly. "I fly to find quiet places inside it." That was as close as he ever came to talking about his emotions. Still, there was warmth in the way he looked after the plane. The way he'd quietly ensure the cabin was stocked with Keanu's favorite tea when he had a cold. Or how he once noticed a flight attendant shaking after a rough landing and brought her a granola bar and a wordless nod of comfort. No one had trained him to do those things. They came from somewhere else. So why the arrest? Keanu turned that question over and over in his mind. Not just why it happened, but why Elias had never said anything. Why hadn't he asked for help? In the quiet hours after Detective Myers left, Keanu sat on the edge of his leather reading chair, Elias's photo still in his hand. The image was simple. Elias standing beside a van, its back doors wide open, revealing carefully stacked boxes of medical supplies and non-perishable food. But the photo unsettled him in ways he couldn't name. He thought about the man he had come to rely on, not just as a pilot, but as a presence, as someone who filled the space between destinations with an unspoken steadiness. Elias was the kind of person who didn't just fly the plane. He protected the silence in the cabin, the rhythm of thought, the moments where Keanu could actually breathe. What kind of man does that for years, while secretly coordinating something that gets him arrested? Keanu's thoughts drifted back to an afternoon 3 years earlier. They had landed at a small airport in Oregon, one of those remote locations with a single runway and a single hangar. The weather had been terrible, rain cutting sideways, visibility reduced to nothing. The other pilots had grounded their flights, but not Elias. He had plotted a workaround, a 30-minute flight delay and a new trajectory that avoided the worst of the storm. When Keanu asked him later if it had been safe, Elias had nodded without ego. "The safe route is usually the quietest one," he had said. The man had a way of making the complex sound simple. But now Keanu wondered how many times Elias had done that with more than weather, and whether he... There was another memory, one Keanu hadn't thought about until now. A flight back from Mexico City. Elias had requested to stop at a different airport for refueling, even though the original route had plenty of options. It had seemed odd at the time, but Keanu hadn't questioned it. When they landed, Elias had stepped out of the plane for about 20 minutes, then returned without explanation. They took off again without delay. Later that evening, Keanu had asked, half joking, "Everything all right with the jet?" Elias had paused for a beat, then replied, "Just wanted to stretch my legs somewhere quiet." It hadn't felt like a lie, but now Keanu could see how much truth might have been left out. Had that stop been part of whatever operation he was now tangled in? Keanu leaned forward and placed the photo gently on the table. Then, he reached into a side drawer and pulled out a smaller notebook, one he used to jot down thoughts mid-flight. The pages were full of fragments, some artistic, some logistical, many deeply personal. He flipped through until he found a short entry from 2 months ago. "Elias took the long way home again. asked to circle over the mountains. Said the air was smoother there. I didn't mind. Gave me time to think. Another entry, weeks earlier. Cabin was colder than usual today. Found a blanket already waiting on my seat. He always notices. Those were the kinds of things that didn't show up on background checks. But they meant something. They were clues, not to a crime, but to character. Keanu rubbed his temples. He still didn't know what Elias had done exactly, but he was starting to believe it wasn't the kind of wrong that came from selfishness. It felt like something else entirely, something that hid in plain sight, something deliberate, and something, he feared, that Elias had never intended him to understand. The lounge at Burbank Airport wasn't luxurious, but it offered something far more valuable: privacy. Tucked away behind security checkpoints and accessible only by private aviation staff, the room was empty except for a low sofa, a coffee table, and the low hum of air conditioning that filled the silence like white noise. Keanu arrived 10 minutes early. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes fixed on the muted television mounted to the wall. The screen flickered through stock reports and weather alerts, but he didn't see any of it. His mind was still turning over the image of Elias Grant, standing beside that van. Detective Hannah Mayers entered exactly on time. She didn't wear a uniform, but her presence had the sharpness of someone trained to see more than what was visible. In her hand was a slim folder, different from the one she'd brought earlier that morning. Keanu stood and offered a polite nod. No handshakes, just a gesture of readiness. "I appreciate you meeting here," she said, taking a seat opposite him. "I didn't want to risk this leaking before we fully understand what we're dealing with." Keanu gave a quiet nod. "Go ahead." She opened the folder and began. Last night, around 10:45 p.m., officers pulled over a rental van in North Hollywood for what started as a routine taillight violation. The driver didn't resist, didn't argue. When asked for ID, he calmly handed over a license. Captain Elias Grant. Keanu's jaw tensed. At first, the officers assumed it was a case of mistaken identity. The van was packed wall to wall with sealed containers, military-style boxes, insulated crates, a few older medical chests. No logos, no obvious markings. One of the officers had just rotated off narcotics detail and suspected it was a smuggling operation. She paused, flipping through the folder. But when they opened the crates, they didn't find weapons or drugs. They found medical kits, hundreds of them, new, sealed, alongside food rations, thermal blankets, even a dozen portable oxygen tanks, all neatly organized, documented by handwritten labels. Keanu leaned forward slightly. "Stolen?" "That was the first theory," Myers said. "But nothing was reported missing. Every item in that van was legally purchased or donated, no serial numbers flagged, no hospital inventories reported theft, no missing shipments. Just off-the-books aid." She slid a photo across the table. "And then we found this." Keanu looked down. It was Elias, dressed in jeans, plain shirt, carrying a weathered medical bag. He was standing outside a run-down building. Children circled him. A few women stood nearby, cautious but calm. Their clothes were worn, their expressions weary, but they were smiling. The photo felt like a secret nobody was supposed to see. Keanu stared at the photograph longer than he meant to. It didn't look like a sting operation or a criminal act. It looked like someone showing up where help was needed and doing it without applause. He finally looked up. "Where was this taken?" "East Los Angeles," Myers replied. "Outside an unofficial shelter. One of the volunteers there snapped the photo a few weeks ago. They didn't know his name. Said he came at night, never asked questions, just dropped supplies, stayed for a few minutes, then left." Keanu tapped his fingers against the edge of the photo. "Was anyone paying him?" She shook her head. "That's the strange part. No one's been able to trace any personal gain. No cash transfers, no shell accounts, nothing." So, what's he being charged with? Mayers hesitated. That's still evolving. Right now, the official charges relate to unregistered distribution of medical equipment. He wasn't licensed for any of this. Some of the supplies require handling permits, even if they're not narcotics, and technically, transporting them across state lines without proper documentation is a federal violation. Keanu frowned. Even if he's giving them away? Especially if he's giving them away, she said quietly. There are strict federal protocols in place for medical donations, for liability reasons, mostly. If something goes wrong, someone has to be accountable. Keanu didn't speak for a moment. The silence in the room thickened, settling like dust. Finally, he asked, "Do you believe he meant harm?" "No," she answered without hesitation. "But the law doesn't measure intent the same way you and I do." Another photo slid across the table. This one showed stacks of supply boxes in a small storage unit. Each crate was marked by hand, with the date, contents, and what looked like a family name or code. They kept records, Myers continued, detailed ones, names, ages, medical conditions, even food preferences. The more we uncover, the more it looks like he's been doing this for years. Keanu felt a strange mixture of admiration and unease rising in his chest. Elias had been flying him around the world, making sure his seatbelt was folded neatly and the cabin temperature stayed at 71 degrees, while quietly coordinating a shadow network of aid from airport hangars and cargo vans. The idea was staggering, and yet, it fit. It explained the quietness, the precision, the calm under pressure. Elias hadn't just been a man of discipline, he had been a man of mission. And somehow he had kept that entire mission hidden from everyone, even the one person who sat 30 feet behind him on every flight. Detective Myers leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting from procedural to personal. "We're still piecing together how deep this goes. The initial arrest was just the surface. Since then, we've found 2 additional storage units, both registered under a shell corporation that, get this, he created 10 years ago. It's called Morning Wind Transport. No flights, no income. Just storage and invoices for donated goods." Keanu listened, unmoving. "What's most unusual," she continued, "is that nobody connected to him seems to know anything about it. His co-workers at Monarch Aviation? Completely in the dark. Neighbors? Just thought he was a quiet guy who fixed his own sprinklers and left for work at odd hours." She pulled out one final image, a close-up of a hand-labeled document, faded from age. It read, "To be delivered before the 14th. Maria's insulin dose runs out on the 13th. Beneath it, a list of syringes, emergency food items, and a children's workbook in Spanish. He was keeping medical logs," Myers said. "This wasn't about playing hero. This was coordinated, sustained. He knew who needed what and when. He wasn't guessing." Keanu's throat tightened. "What are you going to do with all this?" he asked. "Right now, we're treating it as an unauthorized distribution ring. It's technically illegal, but..." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "We've never seen anything quite like this. No financial benefit, no ties to known groups, no propaganda, politics, or profit, just boxes, quiet help, anonymous deliveries." Keanu rubbed his hands together slowly. "You think I knew?" She shook her head. "No. He was careful to keep your name out of it. Not once has your identity come up in his files, contacts, or statements. It's like he built a firewall between his professional duties and this." Keanu looked back at the first photo, Elias in the middle of a group of children. A man who had looked so at home in the sky, now looking entirely at home on cracked pavement with strangers who had nothing. And smiling. Not for a camera, not for applause, but for someone small and scared in front of him. Anu whispered. "Like a surgeon," Keanu whispered, more to himself than to the detective. "Never wasted a move, always precise. I thought it was just professionalism. Now, I'm not so sure." Mayers stood, gently collecting the photos and documents. "I'm telling you all this not because you're a celebrity," she said, "but because you were the only constant in his daily life. If anyone can help us understand why he did this, it's you." Keanu didn't respond right away. He just kept staring at the image of the man who'd been flying him around the world, while quietly holding together a world no one else even knew was falling apart. That evening, long after the conversation with Detective Myers had ended and the photographs had been returned to their folder, Keanu sat alone in his home office, the room lit only by a soft amber lamp in the corner. His laptop was open, but he wasn't typing. The screen had gone dim. Instead, he was holding the same photograph again, the one of Elias surrounded by children near that run-down shelter. It was something in Elias's posture that caught his attention now. The way his shoulders curved forward ever so slightly, the relaxed bend of his knees, the fact that his flight bag wasn't zipped shut. This wasn't a man trying to hide. This was a man who didn't think he needed to. And yet, for nearly 5 years, Keanu had never once seen him speak more than a few words to anyone outside of flight staff. He had never witnessed him out of uniform, unless they were boarding on off days. He couldn't recall a single instance of Elias talking about his weekend, his past, or his plans. It had all seemed professional, but now it felt like a constructed silence, a design, one Keanu had accepted too easily. He rose from his chair and walked to the cabinet where he stored his travel logs. Over the years, he'd kept handwritten notes about filming locations, jet schedules, and trips for personal causes. Not out of paranoia, but out of habit. When your life was always in motion, grounding yourself in the details helped. He began flipping through old entries. There it was, 2 years ago. A flight scheduled to leave Los Angeles for a charity event in Santa Fe. Originally set for 3 p.m., Elias had texted early that morning and asked to depart at 2, said there might be congestion in the western air corridors. Keanu had agreed without hesitation. He remembered it now. Not just the time change, but the way Elias had seemed different that day. More focused, less conversational even by his usual standard. They'd taken off early and landed right on time, as always, but there had been a mid-air deviation in course, something about weather. Keanu checked the route again. The deviation was minor, just 27 miles off the direct path, but it was enough to place them above an airport near the Arizona-New Mexico border. The log noted slight delay for air traffic control clearance to descend. At the time, it hadn't seemed strange. Now, it was a blinking light. He picked up his phone and called David. "Do we still have access to the Monarch Aviation flight archives?" Keanu asked. "I believe so," David replied. "Do you want me to pull Elias's logs?" "All of them," Keanu said. "Everything from the last 5 years." David hesitated. "You think something's buried in there?" Keanu's voice dropped to a whisper. "Not buried, just hidden in plain sight." By morning, David had compiled the data, flight manifests, route confirmations, departure and arrival timestamps. Keanu spread the printed sheets across the long oak table in his study. The numbers looked orderly at first glance, as they always had. But order doesn't always mean transparency. David hovered nearby, sipping coffee but staying quiet. He could sense Keanu's focus sharpening with each detail. "There," Keanu said, pointing to a trip from San Diego to Portland, dated just over a year ago. "Why is there a 2-hour delay in the air when no weather was reported?" David leaned in. "Official log says holding pattern. But that's strange. There's no note of @CC confirmation, and Portland didn't report congestion. And look at this one," Keanu continued, moving to another printout. "LA to Vancouver. Flight plans submitted direct, but the transponder pinged outside of Medford. That's a small municipal strip. Why were we near Medford?" David frowned. "That airport barely sees any traffic. Maybe a refueling?" "No," Keanu said firmly. "We didn't refuel until Canada." They kept going, tracing at least 5 different instances over 3 years where the jet's course had been altered mid-flight in ways that didn't match any logged weather reports or airport communications. Each time, the diversion led within miles of an area known for migrant encampments, rural shelters, or small clinics in underserved regions. It wasn't proof, but it was a pattern. Keanu sank into his chair, rubbing the back of his neck. Helm used our flight plans as cover, he said. He'd request minor airspace deviations that looked routine on paper but allowed him to drop supplies, or maybe even people, without drawing attention. David hesitated. That's ambitious, risky too. Keanu gave a tired smile. That's Elias. Always quiet, always clean, but always doing more than he let on. The more Keanu thought about it, the more it made sense. Elias had access to flight corridors most people couldn't touch. He understood airspace, security gaps, and scheduling blind spots. And more importantly, he had an aircraft, a timeline, and a passenger. Keanu Reeves. That guaranteed minimal interference or inspection. The trust had been absolute. And Elias had used it not for manipulation, but for access. That's when Keanu made the decision. I want to visit him, he said. In person. David looked unsure. I can try to arrange it, but I heard he's refusing visitors. Try anyway. 2 hours later, the call came in. The request was denied. Elias was being held without public access, per his own request. He didn't want press, didn't want attention, but there was a letter. A single-page envelope, handwritten, left with the watch commander the night before. It had no return address, just Keanu's name written in perfect block lettering. David handed it to him in silence. Keanu opened it slowly. The letter was brief, no greetings, no sign-off. Just the quiet voice of Elias Grant, captured in ink, unmistakable in its restraint and clarity. Thank you for trusting me all these years. I never meant to burden you with this. Please, don't blame yourself for not knowing. And that was it. No justification, no explanation, no hint at how far the web of his quiet work extended. Only those 3 simple sentences, enough to say everything and nothing at all. Keanu read it twice, then folded it back into the envelope and set it down beside him. He stared out the window, where the morning light had begun cutting through the clouds. The sky had never looked more complicated. He thought back to all those hours in the air, dozens of flights, thousands of miles. There had always been peace up there. It was the one place where time slowed, where his thoughts could stretch out in silence. He had assumed that peace came from altitude. Now, he realized, it might have come from something else entirely. Maybe Elias had been keeping the sky quiet for both of them. The idea that this man, whose job was to make others feel weightless, had carried so much in secret was deeply unsettling. But there was no trace of regret in that letter. No appeal, no request. Only thanks, and the one thing Keanu couldn't ignore. Elias didn't want him to feel responsible, and yet he did. Keanu stood slowly, envelope still in hand, and returned to the table with the flight logs. He looked again at the unexplained stops, the rerouted paths, the irregular timestamps. They were no longer oddities. They were stories. Hidden within them were choices Elias had made, quiet, calculated decisions to help someone no one else saw. He'd flown Keanu with precision, but he had flown for others with purpose. David entered the room quietly. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Keanu shook his head. No. He didn't want this uncovered for our sake. But what if there's more? There is, Keanu said, but it's not ours to expose. He picked up the letter again, reading it one last time. He could almost hear Elias's voice in it, low, calm, without apology. Keanu turned toward the window and whispered aloud, more to himself than anyone else, You didn't burden me, Elias. You reminded me what it means to serve without needing to be seen. And for the first time in years, the silence around him didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The phone rang 2 days later. It was Detective Myers again, her voice steady but different. She wasn't calling to follow up. She was calling because the investigation had taken a sharp turn, and Keanu needed to hear it directly. "We found a hangar," she said. "Not an active one. Decommissioned, east of Barstow." Keanu waited. "It's registered under a shuttered charter company," she continued. "No staff on record. No tax filings in 5 years. Just a dusty paper trail leading back to Morning Wind Transport, the same shell company Elias used to register the storage units." "What was inside?" Keanu asked. Myers didn't answer right away. "Medical pallets," she said finally. "Dozens of them, some labeled in Spanish, some marked for rural clinics, but none traced to official orders. Everything was sealed, expiration dates current. Most of it was sourced legally, purchased through surplus auctions, medical outlet donations, and a few small pharmaceutical companies we believe were quietly cooperating." Keanu's breath caught. "And Elias?" "El was running the whole thing," she said, "but not alone." As the hours unfolded, so did the truth. Elias had built a network. Not a loud one, not a big one, but a quiet, precise operation made of people just like him. Retired pilots, ex-military logistics officers, grounded aviation engineers, and a few sympathetic doctors who had grown tired of watching medicine go to waste while people suffered. They called themselves the Quiet Skies. No one took credit. No one posted on social media. No press releases. No boards. No funding campaigns. Just action. They met in hangars that no longer served flights. They communicated through encrypted apps, handwritten notes, or in-person handoffs. Everything was tracked manually, filed in folders, kept under lock and key. The silence was the point. Noise got people caught. Noise turned help into spectacle. Keanu couldn't believe what he was hearing. The hangar in Barstow was just one of several locations, each one set up near areas of rural poverty, border towns, or migrant shelters. These weren't random. Elias had mapped them based on a blend of need, neglect, and invisibility. Where the official help rarely reached, that's where they flew. The aircraft? Old Cessnas, crop dusters, ex-military trainers stripped of insignias and rigged for supply weight instead of passengers. They flew at night, under 5,000 feet. No flight plans filed. Only weather checks and precise window timings. It wasn't recklessness, it was strategy. And Elias, quiet, steady Elias, had been the architect. Detective Myers continued her explanation as Keanu sat motionless, absorbing every word. Some of these flights originated from private airfields that had technically been shut down, but still had runways intact. Others launched from properties owned by retired pilots, people who still held valid licenses but no longer flew commercially. They weren't breaking the law in the usual sense, they were just bending it until it blurred. Keanu was silent for a long time. "Maybe he called it what again?" he asked. "The Quiet Skies," she said. No official group registration, no hierarchy, but they had an internal code, a sort of honor system. If you flew a shipment, you logged it by hand, sealed it, and passed it on. No questions asked, just trust. The phrase stuck with him. The Quiet Skies. He could almost hear Elias saying it, the way he used to explain turbulence. Gently, with no drama, like it was all part of the atmosphere. Myers went on. "We found a filing cabinet in the Barstow hangar, locked, but Elias had left the key in his van. Inside were records dating back at least 6 years, lists of communities served, inventories of insulin, antibiotics, children's vitamins, supplies rotated by expiry date. Detailed logs, all in his handwriting." Keanu leaned forward, hands pressed together, his voice low. "This wasn't random. No, she agreed. It was as structured as a nonprofit, maybe more. And from what we can tell, it started with just one family, a woman and her daughter near Yuma. He flew in pediatric medicine, didn't even tell the shelter staff his name. Keanu closed his eyes. He could see Elias behind the controls again, the soft click of dials, the meticulous checks, the gentle landings. It all fit now. That calm wasn't just for safety, it was focus. It was clarity. It was a man who had decided a long time ago what mattered and never said it aloud. What about the doctors? Keanu asked. The pharmacists? Do they know who he really is? Mayers nodded. A few do, retired professionals mostly. Some lost licenses for minor infractions. Some were just tired of the red tape. They called him the clock, said he never missed a window, always arrived within 5 minutes of when he said he would. That kind of consistency earned trust. Keanu looked up sharply. He used our flight schedule, didn't he? Mayers didn't flinch. Yes, your flights were the perfect cover. Whenever you were airborne, he was essentially invisible. No one was going to stop and question a jet carrying Keanu Reeves, especially not if the pilot submitted his logs just right. Keanu's stomach turned. So I was his shield. You were his silence, she said, choosing her words carefully. And I don't think he ever wanted you to feel used. He just knew how much noise follows someone like you, and he used that noise to make room for someone else. Keanu exhaled through his nose, slowly. He knew I'd never ask questions, because he knew you trusted him. The room fell quiet again. Mayers reached into her bag and handed Keanu a small USB drive. What's this? He asked. Flight maps, the ones he didn't log with the FAA. You should see what he built. Keanu held the drive in his palm, its weight impossibly small for what it contained. A map of mercy. Later that night, Keanu sat alone at his desk with the USB drive plugged into his laptop. A simple folder opened. No password, no encryption. Inside were dozens of files, labeled with dates, coordinates, and short, handwritten descriptions. Each one corresponded to a route Elias had flown in secret. He clicked on the first. A map appeared, an aerial route beginning just north of San Diego, veering east toward Imperial County, then curving downward into a no-name desert airstrip. The notes read, Midwife supplies. 3 births expected by Saturday. Drop 2200 hours. Return window, clear skies 23:15. Another file. Calexico, 5 crates. Pediatric kids. 1 child with asthma, 2 malnourished. School enrollment assistance pending. Keanu scrolled through them, stunned by the detail. Elias hadn't just been dropping off supplies, he had been documenting the families, remembering their needs, tracking patterns, building something systematic. The files weren't just logistics, they were human stories, compressed into coordinates and cargo loads. One after another, the routes formed a lattice across the Southwest. California, Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Texas. They avoided major cities, staying close to forgotten highways and heat-scorched communities that didn't make the news. The roads beneath them were cracked, the skies above them were silent. Keanu paused on one route that listed personal funds next to the supply value. He opened the manifest. It showed insulin doses for a woman named Camila, along with new socks and shoes for her 4-year-old son. Value, $423.37. Next to it, Elias had written, in his precise, compact lettering, Mother asked if I was with the government. I said no. She smiled. Keanu leaned back in his chair, heart heavy and full at once. This wasn't a pilot bending rules. This was a man building a parallel system. Unseen, unsanctioned, and yet more efficient than many official programs. And Elias had done it all while piloting jets for the rich and famous, carrying actors, producers, studio executives, shaking hands, offering water, and then, between the hours, flying humanitarian missions through desert nights with no spotlight and no applause. Keanu clicked on the final file. It was a route marked Blackbird. No destination, no cargo, just a note. No delivery, just wanted to hear the quiet again. He stared at the words, then slowly closed the laptop. That one line told him everything. Elias didn't fly because he needed direction. He flew because silence was where he did the work. Where others saw airspace, he saw people. Where others found altitude, he found purpose. And all of it had lived in the quiet skies. It was David who tracked the man down. While reviewing older documents tied to Elias's pilot training, he discovered a name listed under certified instructor, a retired aviation trainer named Howard Lennox, now living outside Tucson, Arizona. When David called, the man didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I trained Elias," he said. "And no, I'm not surprised this is all coming out now." Keanu decided to fly out the next morning. The sun was already dropping behind the cactus-lined horizon when Keanu pulled into the gravel driveway. A small house stood at the end of the path, its wooden porch creaking as an older man stepped out. He wore jeans, a faded t-shirt that read "Flight is Freedom," and a pair of aviator sunglasses that didn't hide the weariness in his face. "You must be Keanu," Howard said. "Come on in." They sat at a kitchen table that looked like it had seen decades of coffee and conversation. Howard didn't waste time. "Held, ever tell you about Afghanistan?" Keanu shook his head. "No, he never talked about the past." Howard nodded. "That's what I figured." He leaned back, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. "I met Elias when he came back stateside," Howard began. 26 years old, been through more than most men twice his age. He'd served as a trauma medic, forward operating base, Helmand Province. Rough stuff. He didn't brag, hell, he barely spoke. Keanu listened without blinking. "Guy saved lives daily," Howard continued. "Triage under fire, patched people up with duct tape and sand if he had to. But the part that stuck with me wasn't what he did in combat. It was what he did after." "What do you mean?" Keanu asked. "After he came home, he didn't disappear like most guys. He signed up for aid flights, volunteer cargo runs to remote villages in Pakistan and Jordan, even hopped planes to Central Africa for a while. All uncredited. No journal write-ups, no NGO badges, just the kind of guy who flew where others wouldn't." Keanu looked down at his hands. "Why didn't he ever say anything?" Howard shrugged. "Because he didn't think it mattered. He wasn't interested in the story. He was interested in the service." He paused, then added, "I tried to get him to apply for civilian awards. There's a whole stack of recognitions for veterans who do humanitarian work. He refused every single one." Keanu's voice was quiet. "What did he say?" Howard stared out the window. "People don't need to know who gave the parachute," he told me. "They just need to know it opened." Keanu closed his eyes for a second. He had flown with Elias for years, shared sky after sky, and never once sensed the weight of that history in the cockpit. Elias had flown like a ghost, invisible but always present. And all that time, Keanu had been sitting 30 feet behind a man who had already lived 100 lives and chosen not to speak of any of them. Howard rose from his chair and crossed the room to a worn filing cabinet tucked beneath an old aviation chart. He pulled out a folder, thick with yellowing paper and creased photos. He laid it on the table between them. "I kept this," he said, "not to spy on him, just I had a feeling he was doing something that wouldn't ever be documented. I figured someone should remember." He opened the folder. The first image was grainy, a shot of Elias in desert fatigues, kneeling beside a makeshift stretcher, one hand gripping a soldier's wrist, checking for a pulse. Sandstorm wind blurred the background, but Elias's face was still, composed, focused. "El never posed for photos," Howard said. "That one was taken by a fellow medic who mailed it to me." Another photo showed Elias standing beside a small prop plane on a gravel runway in Sudan, loading boxes of bandages and sealed water jugs with 2 local teens. No one was smiling. They were just working, delivering, surviving. There were also notes, logbooks, scribbled in Elias's tiny, precise handwriting. Dates, locations, cargo weights, fuel estimates. Every detail mattered. Even in his volunteering, he flew with the exactness of a man whose discipline had been forged under fire. Howard tapped one of the pages. He used to say the world didn't need more people talking, it needed more people arriving. Keanu reached for a photo and held it in his hands for a moment. It was Elias, as a younger man. Clean-shaven, sunburned, eyes hard. He looked nothing like the quiet pilot Keanu had known in the polished uniform and pressed collar. And yet, he was exactly the same. What made him stop? Keanu asked. Howard exhaled slowly. He didn't stop. He just changed how he did it. Keanu looked at him, confused. Flying aid missions gets harder as the bureaucracy builds, Howard explained. You need permits, sponsors, clearances. Elias wasn't built for red tape. So he came back to the States, earned his commercial license, and waited for a door. A door? Keanu repeated. Howard looked him straight in the eyes. Someone like you. Someone the world watches. Someone whose schedule creates perfect shadows. Keanu said nothing. And didn't use you, Howard added gently. He protected you, every detour, every deviation. He made sure it could be explained as operational. Your presence made it possible. But your silence? That's what made it safe. Keanu felt his chest tighten again. He'd spent all that time thinking Elias was just quiet by nature. Now he realized it was something far deeper. Silence had been his armor, his method, his language. And in that silence, he had carried pain, duty, and an unshakable commitment to the invisible. Keanu left Howard's house just after sunset. The Arizona sky had turned molten orange, streaked with the final light of day. The heat was still rising from the ground, but the wind had picked up, a dry, whispering kind of breeze that wrapped around him like a memory. He sat in the car for a long moment, the folder resting on the passenger seat. His fingers traced the edge of the photo inside, the one of Elias kneeling in the desert. That stillness in Elias's face, the kind that only came from knowing chaos firsthand, stayed with him. Keanu thought about their last flight together. Just a few weeks earlier, they'd flown back from Vancouver. It had been one of the smoothest trips in recent memory. Keanu had complimented the landing, a rare comment for him, and Elias had just nodded, offering the usual water bottle with a quiet, "Thank you for flying today." That was it. Not a single hint that he was planning drops later that night. Not a flicker of hesitation. He remembered watching Elias step off the tarmac and walk into the shadows of the hangar. Shoulders relaxed, eyes focused, as if the work was only just beginning. Now Keanu realized that it had been. Dozens of flights, hundreds of hours in the air, thousands of miles. And the entire time, he had been flying with a man carrying not just passengers or cargo, but memories of war, of trauma, of choices no one ever sees. Elias had sat quietly in that cockpit with the weight of every person he couldn't save and the names of every child he had delivered antibiotics for, and he had never said a word. Because to Elias, silence wasn't absence. It was reverence. Keanu pulled out his phone and opened his notes app. Slowly, carefully, he began typing. I shared the sky with a man who had seen more blood than spotlight, who measured time not in hours, but in lives spared. He never asked to be thanked. He never asked to be seen. He just kept flying. He paused, then added one more line. And somehow, I didn't realize that I'd been a passenger in something far bigger than any plane. He locked the phone and placed it on the seat beside the folder. For the first time since Elias's arrest, Keanu didn't feel confused. He felt humbled, and he knew, no matter what happened next, he would carry the story of Elias Grant, not as a headline, but as a quiet truth. The sun had just started to rise over the desert when Keanu arrived in El Centro. The air was dry and still, the roads quiet except for a few early workers heading toward the fields. Detective Mayers was already waiting outside the shelter, her expression serious but calm. She nodded as Keanu stepped out of the car. "They know you're coming. I didn't tell them why, just that someone who knew Elias wanted to meet them." Keanu didn't reply. He looked up at the building, an old stucco church repurposed into a shelter, its roof patched in places, the paint peeling along the windowsills. They walked in together. The smell of warm tortillas and soap filled the entryway. Inside, children were seated around a folding table, working through schoolwork. A few women stood off to the side, watching cautiously, eyes narrowing until they recognized the man beside Detective Myers. Whispers spread quickly. Keanu could feel the shift, recognition, then surprise. But not the kind he was used to. This wasn't about fame. This was about trust. An older woman stepped forward, clutching a faded photo in her hand. She didn't say anything at first. She simply held it out. Keanu took it gently. The image was grainy, clearly from an old phone. In it, Elias was kneeling beside a young boy, holding an inhaler to the child's lips, while the mother looked on in tears. "I'm Sofia," the woman said in Spanish, her voice trembling. "My son had seizures. No one would help us. The clinics said we didn't have documents. They turned us away." Keanu listened, eyes locked on hers. "Then one night," she continued, "a plane landed near the edge of the farm road. Quiet, no lights, just this man." She touched the photo. "He didn't ask questions. He just handed me a box of medicine, looked me in the eye and said, 'You're not alone.'" Her voice cracked. "That was 2 years ago. My son's still alive because of him." Keanu's throat tightened. Another woman stepped forward, younger, with a small girl by her side. The girl clutched a worn backpack with faded cartoon prints. The woman opened it carefully, pulling out a notebook and a bundle of pencils wrapped with string. Then she unfolded a small piece of paper. On it, handwritten in neat, careful Spanish, were the words, "Tu futuro importa. Nunca dejes que el silencio te robe tu voz." Your future matters. Never let silence steal your voice. Keanu knelt slowly, meeting the girl's eyes. She smiled shyly, then handed him the paper. He took it with both hands, and something inside him cracked. Keanu stood, holding the note like it was something sacred. Around him, more families began to emerge from the shelter's interior. Women holding children, teenage boys with backpacks slung over their shoulders, elders with faces lined by wind and time. They didn't swarm him. They approached slowly, respectfully, each one carrying a story in their eyes. A man with a limp stepped forward. His right arm was in a brace, clearly injured long ago. "I was working in the fields," he said in halting English. "Fell from the trailer, couldn't feel my fingers, couldn't work. Clinic wanted papers I didn't have." He glanced down, eyes wet. "Elias brought a brace. Medicine for infection. Paid for physical therapy, cash." Never said his name. Keanu looked over at Detective Myers, who simply gave a small nod. She was hearing many of these stories for the first time too. Another woman held out a baby, barely a year old. "This is Daniela," she said softly. "When she was born, I had no formula, no money, no help. Then a man arrived in a small truck, middle of the night, left a cooler with milk, diapers, everything. I asked him why he cared. He said, 'Because someone has to.'" A few children gathered near Keanu now. One of them held up a crayon drawing. Stick figures under a plane, with a man wearing a hat handing out boxes. The caption, scribbled in shaky Spanish, said, "El hombre del cielo," the man from the sky. Keanu stared at the drawing, his vision blurring. He turned slightly, stepping toward a corner of the room, needing a moment to catch his breath. But the stories didn't stop. They spoke in hushed voices, as if recalling the visit of a saint, one after another. Food, medicine, school supplies, help finding work. Elias had appeared in all their lives not like a celebrity or even a rescuer, but as a constant. Quiet, invisible, dependable. Keanu pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the pressure rise behind his eyes. He had spent his entire career working to create stories on screen. Stories of hope, of sacrifice, of silent heroes. And all this time, one had been sitting 10 feet away in the cockpit, never asking for recognition, never breaking character. This wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was sacrifice, done in the dark, without applause. And now, Keanu stood among the very people who had been changed by it, not as a movie star, but as a witness. Keanu turned back toward the center of the room. There were more now. Over a dozen families gathered, many holding worn photos or medical papers, mementos of moments they had never expected anyone to care about. Each one of them had felt invisible at some point. Each one had been seen by Elias. A young woman stepped forward with a trembling voice, her arms wrapped tightly around a boy with Down syndrome who clutched a toy airplane. "Hell remembered us," she said, "not just once, but every month. Vitamins, learning games, special socks to help with his walking. Who does that?" Keanu opened his mouth, but no sound came. Because the truth was, he didn't have an answer. He didn't know how someone could give so much without leaving a trace. No organization, no email list, no request for donations. Just acts. Pure, deliberate acts of service. Another child approached, no older than 7. She didn't say a word. She handed Keanu a drawing, folded neatly in 4. He opened it slowly. It showed 2 stick figures. One was Elias, clearly recognizable by the aviator glasses and small smile. The other was a little girl with pigtails standing beside a box labeled Juguetos. Toys. Above them, in crooked handwriting, were the words, "Gracias por acordarte de mí." Thank you for remembering me. That was what Elias had given them. Not just supplies, not just survival. He had given them something far more valuable. Dignity. The sense that their lives mattered, even if the world around them insisted they were expendable. He had remembered them when no one else did. Keanu crouched beside the girl, his voice breaking as he whispered, "He never forgot, did he?" She shook her head, then stepped forward and hugged him gently. Not because he was famous, but because he was connected to the man who had saved her sense of worth. Across the room, a woman was watching with tears in her eyes. She stepped forward last, moving slowly, her face both sad and calm. "I was the first," she said. "He told me once." Keanu looked up at her. "My name is Graciela," she continued. 12 years ago, my brother was dying, kidney failure. I didn't have enough money for the medication. I was going to sell everything. And then he appeared." She paused, her voice steady. "I brought 2 weeks' worth of medicine. Said he couldn't promise more, but that he would try, and he did. He came back, again and again. Even after my brother passed, he kept visiting. Not with medicine, but with books for my children. Always the same time of month, always the same quiet knock." Keanu stepped toward her. "Did he ever talk about himself?" She nodded faintly. "Just once. He said he wasn't a hero. Said the word never sat right with him. He said he just wanted to be useful." That was Elias Grant, a man who had given up recognition so others could hold on to hope, a man who never asked to be known, only to be needed. Keanu stood in the center of the room, surrounded by faces marked by both struggle and gratitude. For a long time, no one said anything. And then Keanu spoke, his voice low but certain. "I didn't know," he said. I flew with him hundreds of times. I sat close enough to see the back of his neck. I trusted him with my life. But I didn't know." He paused, swallowing hard. "Now I do." He looked down at the note in his hand again. "Tu futura importa." He turned to the group. "It does. Your future matters. And because of Elias, I see that more clearly than I ever have." Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he didn't hide them. This wasn't grief, it was recognition. A man had chosen to fly through the margins of the world, carrying mercy beneath his wings, compassion behind his silence. And now, in this small shelter in El Centro, that flight had finally landed in the open. The days following Keanu's visit to El Centro felt heavy, not just for him, but for everyone connected to Elias Grant's quiet operation. The truth had surfaced, but it didn't come with celebration. It came with consequences. The legal system wasn't designed to handle men like Elias. By the end of the week, the investigation had grown far beyond what the LAPD could contain. FAA officials reviewed airspace violations. Customs agents flagged the unregistered transport of controlled medical supplies. And then Homeland Security stepped in. They weren't focused on the compassion of it, they were focused on the chain of custody, on the question of what could have gone wrong, on the fact that a man had bypassed nearly every checkpoint meant to regulate air travel and cargo distribution in the country. There were no weapons, no drugs, no money trails, just a growing file of technical violations, minor to moderate on their own, but collectively enough to make the Department of Justice uncomfortable. Prosecutors reviewed every inch of Elias's flight history. They found dozens of unreported landing sites, at least 5 undocumented border crossings, and one deeply troubling fact: not a single person had noticed. That was the real threat. He hadn't been stopped because he'd been reckless. He had never been stopped at all, and that scared them. Still, as the charges escalated, one thing became clear. There was no financial motive, no kickbacks, no offshore accounts. Elias had paid for most of the supplies out of pocket, with traceable debit transactions tied to his own personal checking account. He hadn't hidden the money because there was no money to hide. He had just helped, and the law didn't know what to do with that. Keanu met with Elias's court-appointed attorney twice, a young man, idealistic but overwhelmed, who admitted frankly that he had never seen a case like this. The lawyer said, "But intent to bypass protocol, that's easy. He did it, repeatedly, across state lines, without permits." "What happens now?" Keanu asked. "They'll likely push for a plea deal," he replied. "Avoid trial, quietly file it away. The issue is, he won't cooperate." Keanu frowned. "What do you mean?" "Is refusing bail. Said he doesn't want media attention, doesn't want anyone testifying on his behalf. Says if he stands alone, no one else gets pulled in." Keanu's chest ached at the thought. He reached out through his attorney and offered to cover everything: bail, legal fees, private defense. The answer came swiftly, handwritten on a slip of lined paper. "Please don't spend a dime on me. I'm exactly where I chose to be. My freedom was never the goal." The courtroom was small and unremarkable, tucked inside a federal building that buzzed with quiet tension. There were no news crews, no cameras, just a handful of legal clerks, security officers, and a few curious interns seated along the back row. Keanu entered quietly and took a seat near the rear. He wore a simple black suit, no entourage, no statement. He wasn't there as a celebrity. He was there as someone who had shared the sky with a man whose life now hung in the balance. Elias was led in, wrists cuffed loosely in front of him. He looked thinner than the last time Keanu had seen him, but his posture was as straight as ever. He didn't search the room. He didn't look for support. He moved with the calm of a man who had already accepted the cost of his decision. The judge reviewed the case summary aloud. The charges listed were numerous: unauthorized transport of medical supplies, violation of FAA flight regulations, multiple unlogged airstrip landings, and unlicensed interstate delivery of controlled pharmaceuticals. There was no mention of danger, no acts of violence. But the charges, when stacked, painted a picture of someone who had repeatedly stepped outside the law. When asked to enter a plea, Elias responded simply, "Guilty." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure you don't want to consult your counsel before answering?" Elias shook his head. "I've had all the consultation I need." The prosecutor stood, uncertain. This wasn't going how they expected. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "while the defendant's actions do not appear to be financially motivated, we must acknowledge the scope of his violations. His disregard for federal procedure, safety protocols, and cross-agency coordination, intentional or not, constitutes a serious breach of regulatory systems that exist to protect public safety." Elias didn't react. He kept his eyes on the bench. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Grant, is there anything you'd like to say before sentencing is determined?" Elias stood slowly, the chain at his wrists clinking softly. "I don't need a defense," he said, "and I don't need a lighter sentence. I just want people to know they weren't invisible." The room went completely still. "I've flown cargo, passengers, private contracts. I've seen the gaps no one wants to see. People falling through them every day. Families with nowhere to go, children without medicine. They weren't on anyone's radar. So I made them part of mine." He paused, voice steady. "I didn't break the law because I didn't care. I broke it because someone had to care." From the back of the room, Keanu felt his throat close. He looked down to keep the tears from spilling, his hands clenched in his lap. Elias continued, "I didn't do this for applause. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because I could. Because I had a pilot's license and a map and time. And because when you're given tools, you have a choice. You can use them to serve yourself, or you can use them to serve someone else." He stepped back, voice soft now. "That's all I have to say." The judge looked down at her notes, silent for a moment longer than expected. "We will reconvene next week to determine sentencing," she said. Elias was led away, offering no glance to the gallery. But just before exiting, he paused at the door. For the briefest moment, his eyes met Keanu's. No smile, no nod, just recognition. Keanu held his gaze and gave the faintest movement in return. Not approval, not sadness, just understanding. Elias had chosen the harder sky, and now he was navigating it with the same quiet grace he had always carried in the air. The courtroom may have gone silent, but Keanu Reeves hadn't. In the days following Elias's appearance before the judge, Keanu began making quiet calls. He didn't issue statements to the press. He didn't post on social media. He didn't sit for interviews. But behind the scenes, he moved with quiet determination, the way Elias had always done. He started with people he trusted, discreet donors, private philanthropists, old colleagues who had remained grounded despite their fame. Many of them had never heard of Elias Grant. Some had, but all of them listened as Keanu told them, in his calm, deliberate voice, why this mattered. "This isn't about one man," he said during one call. "It's about what happens when the law can't see people in need, but one man does." He met with a retired aviation attorney over coffee in a hidden back corner of a small cafe in Burbank. She reviewed the FAA regulations Elias had violated and shook her head slowly. "There's nothing in place for people like him," she said. "There are humanitarian air corridors internationally, but inside our borders? Not unless you're FEMA, Red Cross, or military." Keanu nodded. "What if that changed?" She leaned back. "You'd need to build something from scratch, propose policy, get attention without looking like you're trying to get attention. You'd need allies." He already had someone in mind. Senator Jason Larkin had once played Keanu's older brother in a mid-budget drama nearly 2 decades earlier. Since then, he'd traded scripts for speeches, running on a platform of quiet reform. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but he listened. Keanu called his private line. When Larkin answered, he didn't ask how Keanu was doing. He simply said, "I've seen the case. I wondered when you'd reach out." They met in Washington 2 days later, unannounced, unfilmed. In a private office on Capitol Hill, Keanu laid out what he had seen, what he had heard in El Centro, what he had read in Elias's handwritten logs. Larkin listened, one hand resting against a binder of committee notes. When Keanu finished, the senator didn't speak right away. He stood, walked to the window, then turned. "You can't change the law for one man," he said, "but maybe this story changes the law for thousands." Keanu nodded. "That's what I want." Larkin stepped closer. "Then start building, not a campaign, not a defense fund, a structure, something that can fly when he can't." That was the moment the idea solidified. Not just an act of tribute, a blueprint for something bigger. Keanu returned to Los Angeles the next day with a list of names, policies, and loopholes scribbled on yellow legal paper. He laid it all out across the dining table in his home, pages of handwritten notes beside Elias's flight maps and cargo manifests. He didn't see a scandal. He saw a system waiting to be born. Within 72 hours, he had spoken to 3 retired FAA officials, 2 nonprofit logistics directors, and a medical supply chain consultant who'd worked disaster zones in Haiti and the Gulf Coast. Each of them said the same thing in different words. There was no legal infrastructure to allow private pilots to deliver aid within the U.S., not without being licensed as a formal humanitarian organization with government contracts. "But the need is there," Keanu pressed. "We have pilots, planes, equipment, and communities falling through the cracks." "Yes," one expert replied, "but what you don't have is permission." That was what Keanu set out to change. With the help of Larkin's staff, he began drafting the framework for a new kind of nonprofit agency, a legal, licensed, humanitarian aviation network designed specifically for underserved domestic communities. It would be called the Quiet Skies Initiative. The organization would function as a legal alternative to the underground network Elias had quietly built. Volunteer pilots would be vetted, their licenses checked, aircraft inspected. The group would obtain the appropriate permissions for cargo distribution, work with medical professionals, and maintain accountability, while honoring the spirit of what Elias had done. No glory, just results. Keanu refused to be the face of it. He offered funding, structure, and connections, but insisted that the mission stay focused on the people it served. He invited former military medics, retired air traffic controllers, and even migrant community leaders to help design it from the ground up. "This won't work," he said in one planning session, "unless the people we're trying to help are helping build it." Donors began to appear. Quiet ones. A retired tech founder gave startup funds. A studio executive who had lost a sibling to a rural health crisis offered airstrip access on family-owned land in the Central Valley. A foundation in New Mexico pledged to cover fuel costs for the first 6 months. And still, Keanu kept the spotlight away. Whenever someone tried to credit him, he deflected. "I didn't invent this," he said. "I just finally saw it." Meanwhile, Elias remained in holding, still refusing bail. But word of Keanu's efforts reached him through the public defender. The reply came back as a handwritten note. "If anything I did becomes a doorway for others, I'm good with whatever sentence they hand me. Just don't let them close the door once I'm gone." That line stayed with Keanu. He made it the mission statement. Don't let them close the door. He had the website built with minimal design, no faces, just flight paths, medical supply checklists, volunteer applications, a single page titled Origin, with only one paragraph. "This project is named for a pilot who served without fanfare, who saw the gaps in our system and tried to fill them with his own 2 hands. He asked for no credit, so we won't give him any, just continuity." The Quiet Skies Initiative wasn't launched with a press conference. It was activated one night, quietly, by 2 Cessna pilots and a volunteer nurse. They flew to Calexico with boxes of insulin and powdered formula. No cameras, just cargo. And just like Elias had always done, they landed softly, in silence, under the stars. 2 weeks after the Quiet Skies Initiative began its first official deliveries, Detective Myers contacted Keanu again. Her voice, calm as always, carried something different this time. A sense of reverence. "We've cleared the last of the storage units," she said. "There's something you need to see." She didn't say what. She didn't have to. Keanu met her at the unit just outside Van Nuys. It sat in a forgotten industrial corridor, lined with chain-link fences and overgrown weeds. Inside, the light flickered as the metal door slid upward. The air was stale, filled with dust and the faint scent of paper and engine oil. Stacked against the far wall were 4 identical containers, military footlockers, each marked only with a single letter, E. Detective Myers opened the first one. Inside, neatly arranged, were journals. Dozens of them. Black leather-bound, well-worn at the edges, each one labeled by year and flight range. Keys weren't discovered during the first sweep, she said. He told his lawyer where to find the key a few days ago. Keanu reached into the first locker and pulled out a journal marked 2018 West Sector. He opened it slowly. What he saw wasn't just a logbook. It was a world. Every page was handwritten in precise, almost architectural script. At the top of each entry was a date, time, and flight path. But beneath that, family profiles, names, ages, conditions, needs. He turned the pages. Lopez family, El Paso, 3 children. Oldest Marta has chronic asthma, prefers lavender tea. Youngest cries at loud noises. Don't fly low when possible. Alvarez twins, 6 years old. Migrant camp outside Yuma. Allergic to dairy. Bring rice-based meal packs. Mom walks them to the drop zone barefoot. Bring extra shoes. Each note was more than data. It was care. Not clinical, not detached, human. There were small sketches too, maps of abandoned roads, layouts of shelters, even portraits of children drawn in pencil, with faint shading around their eyes and tiny, joyful smiles. Keanu ran his finger along one page where Elias had sketched the interior of a run-down church converted into a sleeping area. At the bottom of that page, a single sentence. Add an extra lantern. They're afraid of the dark. Keanu looked up at Myers, his eyes filled with something unspoken. She said nothing. She just nodded and walked a few steps back, giving him space. Keanu sat down on the cool concrete floor, journal still open on his lap. He turned another page. Delivery to Calexico. Mom had a limp. Recheck in 3 weeks. Bring medical wrap and sugar-free cookies. She didn't ask, but she looked tired. He closed his eyes. Elias hadn't just delivered aid. He had noticed everything. Keanu stayed seated on the floor for over an hour, leafing through Elias's words. The journals weren't arranged like traditional records. They moved fluidly, like Elias's mind did in the cockpit. One moment, a supply list. The next, a hand-drawn airstrip. Then, unexpectedly, a line of quiet reflection. In one journal from 2019, tucked between 2 pages filled with weather forecasts and wind direction notes, Keanu found this. I fly low so the world doesn't look up. They have enough to worry about. He read it again. It wasn't about hiding. It was about protecting others from seeing what he saw. About bearing the burden alone so no one else had to. Another journal, marked Northern Sector 2020, contained entries from the winter months, when aid had become even more difficult to move because of weather and road closures. But still, Elias flew. One page described a family trapped during a cold snap in New Mexico. The mother had a heart condition. The kids hadn't eaten in 2 days. Elias detailed the supply weight to the ounce and how he had to land on a snow-covered rancher's path, measuring wind shear by the movement of fence posts and frost buildup. At the bottom of that page, a short sentence stood alone. She smiled when I handed her the food. That was enough fuel to get me back in the air. Another entry mentioned a schoolboy named Jaime, who'd never seen a plane up close before. Elias drew a small doodle of Jaime saluting next to the tail wing, his backpack nearly falling off his shoulders. Helm asked if he could be a pilot. I told him, "You already are. You just don't have wings yet." Keanu turned the page and felt a sharp ache behind his chest. These weren't just flight journals. They were windows into the heart of a man who had lived invisibly and loved fiercely. A man who didn't write to be remembered, but simply to remember others. Some entries weren't about people at all. There were pages describing the sky. One entire spread was dedicated to a storm he flew around, sketched in streaks of pencil with notations beside each cloud formation. Next to one thunderhead he'd written, "The wind spoke louder here. Had to listen carefully." Keanu smiled faintly, wiping at his eyes. It was all here. The quiet, the care, the burdens no one else had noticed. Every box Elias had ever loaded into a cargo hold had been written about, not just inventoried, but remembered. In the final journal, marked Personal 2022, Keanu found something different. It was shorter, fewer deliveries, more reflections. On the last page, there were only 3 lines. "All day I'll stop flying, not because I want to, because I'll need to. But I hope by then someone else will have learned how to read the sky." Keanu closed the journal slowly, holding it against his chest. He looked around the storage unit, at the neatly labeled containers, the piles of journals, the maps pinned to the inside of the locker door. This wasn't a record of defiance. It was a library of service, and it wasn't meant to stay hidden forever. He stood and took one last look around. Detective Mayer stepped beside him, speaking softly. "We'll be archiving these properly," she said. "Would you like to keep one?" Keanu nodded. "Just one." He chose the first journal, the one marked West Sector, 2018. The beginning. As they exited the unit, Keanu glanced back one more time, the sunlight catching the metal edges of the lockers. He whispered, barely audible, "You didn't need wings, Elias. You were the sky." And with that, he walked out, carrying more than a book. He carried a legacy, page by page, etched in ink, sealed in silence. But now, finally, seen. The approval came quietly, almost as if the system itself was uncertain how to handle it. After weeks of petitioning through his attorney, Keanu was finally granted a private visit with Elias Grant. No media, no legal observers, just a scheduled 30-minute window in a high-security county detention center on the outskirts of Los Angeles. He didn't tell anyone he was going, not his publicist, not his assistant, not even Detective Myers. The visit wasn't about statements or advocacy. It was about something smaller, something deeper. Closure, perhaps. Or maybe it was just respect. The intake process was sterile and impersonal. Keanu signed a waiver, handed over his phone, passed through the scanner. The guard checking him in didn't comment or ask for a selfie. There was something about Keanu's silence, the way he moved with calm intention, that told them this wasn't a celebrity visit. It was personal. He was led down a long hallway lined with reinforced glass and steel doors until they reached a private interview room. A table, 2 chairs, nothing else. The door opened and Elias was already seated, wearing the standard orange jumpsuit, his posture straight, hands folded on the table. Keanu paused at the doorway. For 5 years, this was the man who had greeted him before every takeoff. Always early, always composed, never loud, never overstepping, just there. A constant in the whirlwind of Keanu's life. Now there was no cockpit, no air between them, just silence. Keanu stepped inside, closed the door behind him, and slowly approached the table. He sat across from Elias. No words were exchanged. Not yet. They looked at each other for a long moment. Not as pilot and passenger, not as actor and employee, but as two men who had seen different versions of the same world, quietly, faithfully, without ever truly needing to explain themselves. Elias's face was leaner now, more tired, but his eyes hadn't changed. Calm, steady, like someone who had made peace with the consequences. The silence didn't feel uncomfortable, it felt earned. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice low and even. "You were never just a pilot." Elias didn't flinch. His reply came just as gently, just as certain. "Sorrow, and you were never just cargo." Keanu's lips pressed together as his eyes welled, not with sorrow, but with the weight of everything that had never needed to be said until now. For a while they sat like that, no guards, no interruptions, just 30 minutes that didn't feel timed. Keanu kept his hands folded, resting lightly on the table. His fingers trembled slightly, but not from nerves. It was the gravity of the moment, pressing inward. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a reckoning with all the moments he had missed, all the signs, all the questions he never thought to ask. He watched Elias carefully. The older man hadn't changed his posture. His spine remained upright, eyes steady, expression unreadable. But there was something softer in the corners of his mouth, a hint of knowing, a quiet gratitude that the man sitting across from him had come, not to challenge or to fix, but simply to witness. Keanu took a breath. "I read your journals," he said quietly. Elias nodded slowly. "I figured someone would." "They weren't just logs," Keanu added. "They were stories. People you carried, memories you honored." Elias glanced down for a moment as if gathering words. "I didn't want to forget them." "You didn't," Keanu said. "Now I won't either." Another silence passed between them, deeper this time. Not from lack of conversation, but from mutual understanding. These were two men who knew the value of restraint, who had learned that sometimes silence held more truth than words ever could. Elias finally leaned back slightly, his hands resting in his lap. "You know," he said slowly, "when I flew, I always liked the space right after takeoff, the moment you leave the ground and everything gets quiet. No voices, no city noise, just that soft roar under your feet. That's where I always felt most invisible." Keanu nodded. "But you weren't." Elias looked up again. There was something almost vulnerable in his eyes now. Not regret, just the ache of having lived too long in the shadows. "I didn't do any of it for recognition," Elias said. "I know," Keanu replied. "But people still deserve to know." There was a long pause. Keanu reached into his coat pocket and placed something on the table. A photograph. It was one of the images from the storage unit. A picture of a family in front of a small trailer. The mother holding a young girl. The father clutching a bag of supplies. In the background, barely visible, was the wing of Elias's small cargo plane. A boy stood beside it, staring up with wide eyes. "Maybe we'll remember you," Keanu said. Elias looked at the photo but didn't touch it. He simply closed his eyes and nodded once. "I don't need bail," he said after a moment. "And I don't need a reduced sentence." Keanu's brow furrowed. "Why?" "Because this isn't about me. If they let me off, it becomes a headline, a one-time exception. I'd rather the law change for everyone. Quiet skies aren't just mine, they're all of ours." Keanu stared at him, the depth of Elias's conviction settling like a weight in his chest. Even now, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about the network, the nurses, the warehouse workers, the families in need. "You'll be remembered," Keanu said softly. "I hope not," Elias replied. "I hope the work is..." A few more minutes passed. No fanfare, no promises. just presence. Keanu stood slowly. "You still fly," he said, "just in different ways now." Elias looked up, and for the first time in the entire meeting, a faint smile crept onto his face. "Maybe," he said. "Maybe the air just moves through other people now." Keanu extended his hand. Elias looked at it for a moment, then reached across the table and took it. It wasn't a handshake. It was a transfer of memory, of meaning, of mission. A buzzer sounded faintly down the hall, the signal that their 30 minutes were over. Keanu nodded once, quietly picking up the photograph and placing it back in his pocket. He didn't ask for more time. He didn't need to. As he walked toward the door, he paused and looked back one final time. Elias sat alone now. His gaze turned to the wall, as if already charting invisible skies in his mind. Keanu didn't speak. He just stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch between them like the wind between wings. Then he turned and walked out. No cameras, no applause, just footsteps and the quiet hum of something that had always been bigger than either of them. The first headline appeared 3 days after Keanu's visit to the jail. It was quiet at first, buried on page 5 of a mid-tier news site. "Private pilot arrested in smuggling investigation, ties to celebrity charters?" The article was vague, filled with speculation. It mentioned the involvement of Homeland Security and hinted at something deeper beneath the surface, but offered few facts. One sentence stood out. The pilot, known to have flown Keanu Reeves on multiple international routes, declined legal counsel. Keanu didn't respond. He didn't call his publicist. He didn't draft a rebuttal or release a statement to clarify the connection. Instead, he did what Elias had done all his life. He went quiet. The next day, the story gained traction. More outlets picked it up. Talk show hosts made assumptions. Anonymous sources chimed in with unverified claims. The internet buzzed with questions. Had Keanu known? Was he involved? Was this the beginning of another celebrity scandal? Still, Keanu said nothing. But behind closed doors, he was working. He convened a private meeting in a borrowed conference room at a quiet campus in Burbank. Only 5 people were in the room: Keanu, Detective Myers, a retired Air Force logistics officer, a trauma nurse who had once worked with Elias, and a man named Raphael, who had helped maintain the hangars used in the covert supply routes. On the table in front of them was a folder, thick and worn. It contained maps, names, handwritten notes, and a list of airstrips most people had never heard of. In the corner of the folder, Keanu had written 2 words: "The Grant Initiative." He looked at the group and said, "We don't talk to the press. We don't wait for approval. We do what he did, quietly." The trauma nurse nodded. "What are we building?" "A non-profit," Keanu replied. "Privately funded, volunteer-based, focused on delivering aid to the places no one else sees." Raphael leaned forward. "What do we call it?" Keanu tapped the folder again. "This is the name. Grant meant something. It still does." They spent the next 5 hours mapping out logistics. The Air Force officer helped design flight protocols that would satisfy FAA regulations without compromising urgency. The nurse offered connections to remote clinics and shelters. Myers, off-duty and unofficially involved, provided legal outlines to keep the network in compliance. By the end of the day, they had a name, a mission, and a plan, all without a single camera in the room. Within 10 days, the Grant Initiative was formally registered as a non-profit. No red carpet launch, no celebrity-packed gala, just a simple line of text on a website with a matte gray background. For those who were never seen, for those who never asked, for those who flew low so others could stand tall. Keanu donated the first $1 million quietly, under a foundation name that didn't bear his own. A few close friends followed, giving what they could without fanfare. Some donated aircraft, others offered medical supplies. An old aviation tech from Arizona offered free hangar space in exchange for nothing but silence. Meanwhile, the press storm grew. Paparazzi started camping near Keanu's driveway. A few media vans parked outside the small airfield where he sometimes boarded private flights. Questions flew like confetti across social media. The headlines shifted from vague suspicion to open curiosity. Keanu's pilot or secret humanitarian? Did Hollywood star unknowingly fund a rogue operation? Grant's secret skies. What did Keanu know? Still, no interviews, no comments. One morning, a reporter cornered him outside a grocery store, camera already rolling. "Keanu, are you going to speak about the arrest of Elias Grant? People want to know your involvement." Keanu looked directly into the lens. His voice was calm but steady. Some stories don't need cameras. They just need wings. Then he walked past the camera and disappeared into his car. That one sentence echoed across platforms within hours. It became a headline, it became a meme, but most importantly, it became a call to action. Donations to the Grant Initiative quietly tripled in 48 hours. But behind the scenes, things weren't as peaceful. Keanu struggled with doubt. Each night he reread Elias's final note. He still heard the words from the jail, "You were never just cargo." He couldn't help but replay every moment they'd shared in the sky. The times Elias would gently tap the throttle, look back, and offer a glass of water with a nod. The way he never explained turbulence, never dramatized takeoff, never said more than needed. A man who flew with a calm that came from something deeper. And now he was behind bars, voluntarily, without asking for help, without asking for anything. Detective Myers met with Keanu one evening after a long shift. They sat on a bench outside the old hangar that had become the Grant Initiative's West Coast base. "People are starting to realize," she said. "They're reading the court transcripts, seeing who this man really was." Keanu nodded but didn't answer. "You know," she continued, "there are senators talking about creating a category for emergency humanitarian aviation. Quiet skies might have started something bigger." He looked out at the runway. "I never wanted credit," Keanu said. "And now, he might change the law." "That's how change happens," she said. "Not by asking, by doing." The following week, Keanu received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a journal, clearly one of Elias's. But it hadn't been recovered from the storage unit. This one was different. It was newer, more personal. It began with a sentence that shook Keanu. "If I don't make it back, and you're the one reading this, thank you for seeing me without asking who I was." The pages detailed recent flights, close calls, aid missions that didn't make it, and quiet victories that never reached the news. One page listed all the names of the children Elias had flown medicine to, their birthdays, their favorite colors, what they wanted to be when they grew up. At the bottom of that page, he had written, "Maybe the world doesn't need more heroes, just more hands willing to lift quietly." Keanu closed the journal and placed it on the shelf beside his desk. He didn't cry this time. He simply sat in silence, as Elias would have preferred. The next morning, the Grant Initiative launched its first official mission. 2 volunteer pilots lifted off from an unregistered airstrip in Nevada, carrying thermal blankets, seizure medication, canned food, and water filters to a community 2 hours south of the border. No cameras, no media, just wings. Keanu stood at the edge of the runway and watched them disappear into the sky. In the press, speculations continued, but in the skies, something better had taken flight. The morning of Elias Grant's sentencing arrived quietly, but the courthouse in downtown Los Angeles was anything but ordinary. There were no flashing lights, no shouting crowds, but the line of people wrapped around the building was longer than anyone expected. Inside, the courtroom was filled with a strange stillness, not silence, but an atmosphere so dense with emotion, it felt like everyone was holding their breath at once. Keanu sat quietly in the back row, wearing a plain black suit, no sunglasses, no entourage, Just him and the silence he now understood Elias had always carried. He didn't want to be recognized, and yet he knew he would be. Still, this moment wasn't about him. It was about a man who had chosen the shadows, who had flown under the radar, literally and figuratively, for years, helping people who had been forgotten. And now, for the first time, the system had to decide what to do with a man who had broken the law for reasons that didn't fit neatly on any page of the penal code. As the judge entered and the room stood, Elias didn't look around. He didn't seek out familiar faces. He stood when told, sat when instructed. His face remained still, his posture firm, like a man not defending himself but preparing for a final departure. Before the sentencing began, the judge addressed the courtroom. "I have received an unprecedented number of letters regarding Mr. Grant," she said, her voice calm but heavy. "They come from doctors, families, veterans, teachers, former law enforcement, even state legislators." She lifted a stack of printed letters from her bench. Some of them speak of lives saved, some of dreams preserved, some of quiet moments of humanity that would have gone unseen had this case never come to light. The prosecutor stood to speak. He was younger than expected, maybe late 30s, with a sharp suit and nervous energy, but his tone surprised the room. "Your Honor, while the state acknowledges Mr. Grant's violation of federal aviation and customs law, we also recognize this case is unique. The defendant's actions were not for personal gain. He broke laws, yes, but he did so in the service of others. We defer to the court's discretion." A murmur swept through the room. Next, Detective Hannah Mayers stood up from the gallery. She hadn't planned to speak, but something made her rise. "Your Honor," she said, "I was the lead investigator on this case, and I just want the court to know, I've worked this job for 17 years. I've never seen a man so reluctant to be defended, so unwilling to name names, so committed to shielding others, even when it cost him everything." She glanced over at Elias, then continued, "This was never about attention. It was never about defiance. It was about quiet service. I believe if you sentence him harshly, the only message we send is that the law has no room for grace." The judge nodded slowly, then called for a short recess. People whispered softly. Some wept. A woman in the second row held a worn photograph of her son. He'd received life-saving insulin flown in by Elias 3 years ago. When court resumed, the room went still again. The judge looked directly at Elias. She didn't read from notes. Her words came slowly, deliberately, as if shaped by both law and something deeper. "Mr. Grant," she said, "you violated several federal statutes, including unauthorized use of airspace, failure to report customs data, and unsanctioned distribution of controlled substances. These are not minor infractions. Under normal circumstances, these actions would carry prison time." She paused. "But these are not normal circumstances." Elias's eyes met hers without flinching. "This court has read hundreds of letters describing the consequences of your actions, not in terms of laws broken, but lives saved, children treated, communities reached. You created an unsanctioned network of relief, yes, but not for personal enrichment. You risked everything for people who had nothing." She leaned forward slightly. "I cannot ignore the law, but I also cannot ignore humanity." A silence fell again, heavier than before. "It is the ruling of this court that Mr. Elias Grant will serve 5 years of supervised probation and 2,000 hours of community service, to be performed in direct service to under-resourced medical organizations. There will be no incarceration." Pierre Sadie. There was no outburst, no gasps, just the sound of people beginning to breathe again. A quiet wave of tears rolled through the gallery like a tide. Several people closed their eyes, pressing tissues to their faces. A man in the third row, an older veteran in uniform, stood up and saluted. Elias didn't smile. He didn't collapse with relief. He simply bowed his head, then looked straight ahead. A flicker of something passed across his face. Not pride, not victory, but something deeper. A quiet form of acceptance. Keanu closed his eyes, not in triumph, in reverence. This wasn't justice in the traditional sense. It was something rarer, a moment where the system listened to people it usually didn't hear. After the verdict, people filed out slowly. Some shook hands, some embraced. Most were silent. Keanu remained seated, letting the room clear around him. When Elias was led past him in cuffs for processing, their eyes met for the first time that day. Keanu gave him a subtle nod. Elias returned it. No words passed between them. None were needed. Outside the courthouse, cameras waited, but Keanu walked past them. A few reporters called out his name, but he kept moving. He wasn't there for headlines. He had already said all he needed in the quiet halls of a courtroom where one man's sacrifice was finally seen. That night, news anchors across the country struggled to frame the story. Was Elias a criminal or a hero? Should he have been punished more severely or not at all? Pundits debated the legality. Online forums exploded with arguments and praise. But within the communities Elias had served, refugee shelters, rural clinics, migrant families, there was no debate. They knew exactly who he was, the man who showed up when no one else did. In the weeks that followed, support for the Grant initiative soared. Volunteer pilots reached out from across the country. Donations came in steadily, many accompanied by handwritten notes that simply read, "Thank you for not forgetting us." Elias began his community service quietly. He declined interviews, refused to speak at events. He swept clinic floors, sorted supply boxes, delivered bandages. He wore a name tag like everyone else. When asked why he still flew under the radar, he gave the same answer. "I was never the story." But the truth was, his story had become a ripple that was still expanding. Not because of headlines, but because of how it made people feel. Seen, inspired, changed. Keanu continued to fund and support the initiative without fanfare. He made one public comment weeks after the sentencing. A journalist asked him at a red carpet event if he thought Elias got off easy. Keanu paused. Then he said, "No, I think we all got off lucky, because men like him still exist." Then he walked away, and that was the end of it, at least in public. But in quiet corners of the world, in hospitals, in hangars, in courtrooms, people started asking different questions. Not just about what's legal, but about what's right. And the memory of a quiet man who never asked to be seen became a movement that refused to be ignored. After the courtroom faded from the news cycle and the national conversation turned elsewhere, Elias Grant quietly disappeared from the public eye. He did not give interviews, no press conferences, no book deals, no memoirs. He never stepped on a stage, never accepted an award. He simply vanished. But he didn't vanish into silence. Not really. In the skies over the southwest above, stretches of desert where the sun bakes the ground and few people look up, there began to appear a particular aircraft. Small, sleek, and modest in design, it bore no airline insignia, no call letters on its tail, no registration that could be traced. Except for one thing. Painted just behind the cockpit window, small and unobtrusive, was a single white feather. At first it meant nothing to most, an odd detail, easily missed. But for some, those who had followed the story of Elias Grant, or those who'd once seen him land where no other pilot would, it was unmistakable. They called him the Sky Ghost. Pilots working out of tiny rural airstrips said they'd see the white feather plane touch down just before sunset. It would stay for no more than an hour, sometimes less. Then it would rise again and vanish into the dusk without filing a flight plan, without radio contact, without a word. At these landings, something always changed. A new stockpile of medical supplies would be found waiting by the hangar door. or a box of notebooks in Spanish and English with children's names neatly labeled. A few times, locals found nothing but an envelope with cash and the words, "For fuel and hope," scrawled on the outside. No one saw who stepped out of the plane. No one took photos, and if they did, they never shared them. It became an unspoken rule in these remote corners of New Mexico, Arizona, and California. You don't photograph the ghost. You just wave. You just receive. You just pass it on. One night, in a dusty outpost near the border, a mechanic named Jorge caught sight of the man in the cockpit. He was refueling an old twin Jenny when the white feather plane glided in with a gentle hum and parked beside him. The pilot stepped out. Jorge froze. He recognized him. The quiet face from the news, the courtroom, the controversy. But the man didn't speak. He just nodded, lifted a crate marked insulin and sterile gloves, and handed it over. Jorge didn't ask questions. He just placed the crate in the back of the supply truck and whispered, "Gracias." The man nodded once more, returned to his plane, and within minutes vanished into the dark. Jorge never told the media. He didn't write it on social media. He told his daughter, years later, in a hushed tone, "That man, he flies for those who have nothing. He's not gone. He's just gone quiet." Stories like hairs spread in hushed tones across small desert towns and among workers at forgotten clinics along the southern edge of the country. They were always similar. Quiet arrivals, unmarked boxes, no expectations of recognition. Just the sound of wheels touching gravel and a man with tired eyes stepping from the cockpit long enough to deliver something someone desperately needed. No one knew exactly where the white feathered plane came from. Mechanics suspected it was housed somewhere off the books, maybe in one of the old Cold War bunkers repurposed as personal hangars. A few guessed it was moved constantly, kept mobile to avoid tracking. It was never seen twice at the same location in 1 week, but it always arrived when it was needed most. At a Navajo health post near Shiprock, a nurse named Dana woke one morning to find a full box of prenatal vitamins and portable diagnostic kits stacked neatly outside the door. Inside the box was a sticky note. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate, familiar. "Keep going. They need you." She never spoke the name aloud, but she recognized the sentiment. She'd followed the trial, wept at the stories from El Centro, and had once clipped a newspaper photo of Elias standing in silence as the verdict was read. Years later, she still kept that sticky note inside her stethoscope case. Keanu heard whispers, too. Volunteers from the Grant Initiative began receiving anonymous donations, always untraceable, always purposeful. Aviation fuel, solar refrigeration units, even a set of drone kits for remote surveying. Each delivery came without explanation, but the feather symbol was scrawled on the outermost box. Once, a mechanic from the initiative returned from a scouting trip in West Texas with his eyes wide and hands trembling. All he could say was, "I think I saw him." He smiled. That's all. Keanu never confirmed it. He never tried to track the plane. He didn't want to. Somewhere deep inside, he knew Elias wouldn't want thanks, credit, or applause. He just wanted to work, to give what others had ignored, and to remain unnamed, by choice, not by accident. In time, the legend of the Sky Ghost began to ripple beyond aviation circles. He became a symbol, an unofficial emblem for those who chose action over noise, for the medics who crossed borders with nothing but backpacks, for the pilots who trained in silence and flew without promise of praise, for every soul who delivered dignity with no demand for return. In schools across the borderlands, children began drawing white feathers in their art classes, not because they were told to, but because they'd heard the stories. A man who flew alone to bring them insulin, books, blankets, and hope. They didn't know his name, only his message. You are not forgotten. Keanu kept a framed drawing from one of those children in his study. A crayon sketch of a white plane flying through a blue sky, with a bright feather on the side and small hearts drawn in the corners. He'd received it anonymously, with no return address. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of something Elias once wrote in his journal. "I don't need the sky to see me, I need the ground to rise." That line, once hidden in a dusty storage unit, now lived in the hearts of thousands. And far above, tracing the lonely edges of the horizon, a single white-feathered plane continued its route. Unseen by radar, known only by need. A quiet return, but never truly gone. The letter arrived without fanfare. No courier service, no tracking number, just a simple stamped envelope, slightly worn at the corners, resting quietly in Keanu's mailbox. The return address wasn't printed, only a faint postmark from El Paso. At first glance, it could have been from anyone, but as Keanu turned it over in his hand, a strange stillness settled in his chest. He brought it inside and sat at his kitchen table, the envelope untouched for nearly an hour. There was something sacred about it, like disturbing it too soon would break whatever invisible thread was holding the moment together. Outside, the afternoon light filtered gently through the windows, casting long shadows across the tile. Inside, Keanu sat unmoving, his hands resting flat on the wood, the letter placed just before him. Finally, with a deep, slow breath, he slid his finger under the flap. The handwriting was unmistakable. Clean, sharp strokes, no hesitation. Elias Grant had always written like a man who knew exactly what needed saying and exactly how much. The paper smelled faintly of jet fuel and dry air. One folded sheet, no fanfare, no extra pages, just a message written in deep blue ink. "You never asked me why. Maybe because you already knew. We both carry ghosts. We both try to give them somewhere to land. Thank you for letting me fly." There was no signature, just the trailing line of the last sentence, which hung on the page like it was still hovering in the air. Keanu read it once, then again, then a third time. His fingers traced the words as if he were trying to commit the texture of them to memory. He stood slowly and walked to the bookshelf where he had placed the last of Elias's journals, the one with the sketched feather on the inside cover. It sat between a leather-bound notebook of Keanu's own notes from his first film and an old paperback copy of The Little Prince, yellowed and softened from age. He opened the journal to the last page, the one that had been left blank. Without a word, he folded the letter neatly and slid it inside. Then he closed the book. It didn't feel like an ending, not really. It felt more like the quiet space between two radio calls, or the breath before liftoff. Keanu looked at the shelf one last time, then turned away as the evening light deepened across the room. Keanu didn't speak about the letter to anyone, not to his assistant, not to his publicist, not even to the senator who had helped him lobby for the new aviation protections that now bore Elias's name. It wasn't that the words were too painful. They weren't. They were quiet, heavy in a way that didn't hurt, but lingered. That night, Keanu sat out on his balcony with a glass of water, the city humming far below, lost in its own stories. Planes blinked in the distant sky, commercial routes cutting across LA like threads in a tapestry. And somewhere out there, maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, he imagined that small, unmarked aircraft with the white feather painted near its tail. No destination filed, no passenger manifest, just a pilot carrying hope, one flight at a time. Elias had always flown like that, even when no one noticed. Keanu thought back to the early days, when he had first hired Elias without much fanfare, just trusting the quiet recommendation from a friend at the aviation agency. There had been no grand introduction, no firm handshake and overly rehearsed enthusiasm, just a nod and a question. Where do you need to go? At the time, it had seemed like a logistical matter, a convenience. Keanu needed privacy, flexibility, and someone who wouldn't gossip. But over the years, Elias had become more than just the man behind the controls. He became a constant. The space between cities, the silence that allowed Keanu to prepare, reflect, recover. And now that silence held meaning Keanu hadn't grasped before. He picked up the journal again, opened it, and read the final letter one more time. "You never asked me why. Maybe because you already knew." Keanu let that sentence settle in him. It wasn't guilt he felt. Elias had made choices out of purpose, not desperation. He wasn't running from anything. He was running toward something. Someone. Many someones, each time he took off. Still, the thought persisted. How had he missed it? How had he flown beside this man for 5 years and never once asked what his eyes were holding? Keanu thought of the night they'd sat together in the jail visitor room. No handcuffs, no drama, just metal chairs and tired eyes. Elias had said, "And you were never just cargo." It wasn't a joke. It was acknowledgement. For both of them, flight had been more than distance. It was the space they used to make peace with the world, and sometimes with themselves. That thought stayed with Keanu as the night deepened. The sky turned darker, the city lights colder. Somewhere, a helicopter passed overhead, and he looked up, as he always did. But this time he wasn't just watching flight. He was listening for it. He remembered a line from one of Elias's journals. He had read it just once, scribbled in the margin beside an entry about a landing in Arizona. They think silence is the absence of noise, but sometimes silence is the only way to be heard. Keanu repeated the sentence in his head like a mantra. It explained so much. The lack of recognition, the refusal to take credit, the hidden service. Elias had lived a life invisible by design, and not out of shame or secrecy, but because some missions are never meant to be seen, just completed. Keanu stood up and walked over to the small shelf beside the balcony door. On it sat a framed photo of his daughter, a candle. And now, he placed the journal there too, not as a trophy, but as a quiet reminder. Because ghosts, as Elias had written, need somewhere to land, and Keanu would keep making room for them. The airfield was still. Just past dawn, a soft wind rolled over the tarmac like a breath being held. Keanu sat alone on the cold metal steps outside the old hangar, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. A faded sky bloomed overhead, neither blue nor gray, just the hushed color of beginning. There were no planes taking off, no sounds of engines whining, just the hum of early light. He hadn't planned to come here. He'd driven without telling anyone, without an assistant or a camera trailing behind. His car was parked off the main road, hidden behind a chain-link fence lined with brush. He just wanted a place to sit, somewhere real. Somewhere Elias had once stood. The last few months had passed like a blur. His days were filled with meetings for the Grant Initiative, quiet fundraisers, anonymous donations. He had spent hours on video calls with policy advisors, helping them build something legitimate out of a man who had never wanted the spotlight. Even now, even with the nation talking about humanitarian flight corridors and ethical exceptions to FAA law, Elias Grant had disappeared into the silence as quickly as he had emerged from it. But his absence wasn't emptiness. Keanu looked out toward the horizon. A pale orange line traced the edge of the world. He whispered under his breath, barely audible, "Some people don't want to be seen. But we still need to look." He had learned something about presence, that there were lives so devoted to others they left no room for their own names. Elias had flown hundreds of missions, moved mountains of medical supplies, saved children he would never see again, and he had never spoken of it once. Not even when Keanu had sat across from him in private lounges, or on quiet runways, sipping the same glass of water Elias always prepared. There had been no hints, no moments of boast, just silent service. The letter Elias had written still rested in Keanu's jacket pocket. Folded twice. No envelope. Just blue ink on lined paper and a closing line he kept replaying in his mind. We both carry ghosts. We both try to give them somewhere to land. The words had hit differently. Not like advice, not like confession, more like recognition. Keanu stood slowly and walked a few steps across the hangar platform. The cracked cement beneath his boots was familiar. He remembered the day years ago when Elias had guided him safely through a storm over British Columbia. Everyone else had been nervous. Elias had been calm. Precise. After landing, Keanu had thanked him like he always did. Elias had nodded, silent as ever. Now he wondered how many storms Elias had weathered alone, storms no radar could see. Keanu had thought of all the people he'd met since the arrest. Sophia, her son, the refugee girl who held that old backpack with the school books and the note, the retired engineers, the former nurse who worked as a courier now, a quiet army of forgotten heroes. He sat back down and looked out again, this time with something like peace. A hawk passed overhead, gliding low, almost as if it were following a route only it could see. Keanu traced its path across the sky, imagining Elias watching it too, somewhere far from cameras, still flying, still helping. They called him the Sky Ghost now. The name had caught on in whispers across dusty towns and unlisted runways. Volunteers said the white-feathered plane came without warning, left before anyone could say thank you. No announcements, just needs met quietly. Keanu exhaled. Not from exhaustion, but understanding. Not everyone needed applause, not every story belonged to headlines. He turned slightly and looked toward the old windsock flapping gently in the breeze. The same air that once carried him across continents had also carried Elias toward people most of the world forgot. That was the legacy now. Not the scandal, not the court, but the lives that had been touched by a man who never wanted his name spoken. Keanu reached into his jacket and took out the letter again. He unfolded it slowly, reading it one more time, even though he already knew every word. You never asked me why. Maybe because you already knew. We both carry ghosts. We both try to give them somewhere to land. Thank you for letting me fly. He folded it back, pressed it flat, and slid it gently into the back of the last journal, the one with maps and weather notes and little red stars marking shelters. Then he zipped it shut and held it for a long time on his lap. His fingers brushed the worn edges. The ink had faded in places, but the care had not. The sun was full now, gold spilling across the horizon. A new day beginning not with noise, but stillness. Keanu looked into the camera set up quietly across from him. He hadn't planned to speak, but the team had asked if he would say a few words. Not for press, not for publicity, but for those who might one day wonder. So he leaned forward slightly and said, "This story isn't about me. It never was. It's about the people you never see, the pilots who fly low, the nurses who don't clock out, the children who wait in silence for medicine that might not come." He paused, letting the silence speak too. "Some people don't want to be seen," he said softly, "but we still need to look." His voice didn't tremble. It wasn't rehearsed, just honest. Then, almost as if to mark the close, he sat back again and let the wind carry his words away. He let the moment rest. After a few quiet seconds, he offered a question, not a plea, not a pitch, but an invitation. Have you ever met someone hiding greatness behind silence? Another pause. Then, one more line, one that he hoped would open something in someone watching. What story should we tell next? No music played, no banner scrolled. The screen faded to the image of the hangar behind him, bathed in morning light. Just stillness. And the feeling that somewhere, high above, someone was flying low. exactly where they were meant to be.